For those of you who were at the privacy session, you may have gotten a flavor of Andrew's thinking. Andrew Keene has just written a book. He's written several books, and he's going to be interviewed by Declan McCullagh, who is a longtime technology writer, currently writing for CNET. And now I'm going to give it to you guys.
Okay, well, thank you. We are your lunchtime entertainment today, and delighted to be your lunchtime entertainment. I work for CNET, which is part of CBS, and spent 10 years in Washington, D.C., and is now living happily in the heart of Silicon Valley. And the other half of your lunchtime entertainment is Andrew Keene. Andrew Keene is a reliable curmudgeon who makes a living as a professional iconoclast. If Silicon Valley holds an idea dear, if it's been celebrated on the front pages of CNET or TechCrunch or GigaOM, the wonders of social networking, or the mixed culture, the merits of user-generated content, you can count on Andrew to have explained why everyone else is wrong. And as far as I can tell, Andrew especially disdains the 1960s counterculture and is convinced that it has taken up residence in Silicon Valley's latest trends. Tim O'Reilly, who created the invite-only foo camp for the Valley's aspiring elite, the ones who haven't quite arrived, says of Andrew, he's pure and simple, looking for an angle, and just wants to sell books. He has 2 books out, Cult of the Amateur and Digital Vertigo. Digital Vertigo just came out. I recommend that you read it. So let's talk about that for a second, Andrew. One of the quotes from it is, our privacy is sacrificed to the utilitarian tyranny of a collective network. And another one is, sharing has become the new Silicon Valley religion. Now, I mean, the sharing generation, they're in their teens or 20s, and I presume that you're probably in your 50s or close to it, although you look only 40. I mean, they just want to share. What's wrong with that? Is this just businesses responding to what customers want?
Consumers just want to share. I think that the majority of consumers on the internet have really no idea what they're doing in terms of sharing. I have a 14-year-old, and he doesn't understand the way in which his data is being used and perhaps in some ways exploited. So I think one of the challenges we have in Silicon Valley, and you introduced me as a kind of outsider, but I'm more of an insider. I mean, I have a show on TechCrunch, and I live in Northern California. I think one of the challenges we all have is being more transparent and accountable in the way in which the data on the internet is being used and perhaps in some ways exploited. Silicon Valley is very good at preaching the orthodoxies of openness and transparency to everyone except themselves. And of course, the companies that most noisily articulate the cult, the orthodoxy of transparency, particularly Facebook and Google, are the 2 companies who are most responsible for misusing data and playing this endless cat and mouse game with consumers over how their data is being used and in some ways exploited. So I think these are real issues. I think it's very troubling if you just dismiss them by assuming that teenagers on the internet or people who have just got online are very much aware of the way in which their data is being used. I think one of the challenges we have is encouraging or perhaps even forcing many of these social networks to be much more explicit and much clearer about how they use and don't use the data. So terms of service, for example, need to be simplified. The LinkedIn terms of service is 7,000 words. You'd have to be a lawyer. You'd have to hire a lawyer to understand it. So most people don't really understand what's going on with their data on the internet, and it's a massive issue.
Well, it's, I didn't mean to paint you as an outsider. I mean, you've been there since the mid-90s. You had a company. You founded a company, and so maybe you're better positioned than most to critique this. But let's move on to your critique of Web 2.0. You've compared it to communism using the phrase a grand utopian movement. You've taken aim at Larry Lessig, a thought leader in this movement. Another quote is that it's inherently dangerous to culture and the arts. I mean, this is, you sounds like you're channeling the recording industry or Hollywood. Now, we have some lobbyists from the recording industry in Hollywood in the audience, News Corp, NBC, Universal, and so on. Would you agree with them that we need new copyright laws, the Stop Online Piracy Act, or SOPA, that became so controversial early this year?
Well, I wrote, some of you may be familiar with a book I wrote in 2007 called Cult of the Amateur, which argued that the free economy was very problematic in terms of supporting a professional class of writers, musicians, filmmakers on the internet. And I showed in the book that as we had the expansion of the internet, and particularly free content on the internet, we've seen this crisis in the music industry, the closing of newspapers, an impending crisis of the publishing business, which I'm very familiar with as an author. I wrote that book in 2007. It was heavily criticized by people like Lessig, who argued that I was a reactionary, that I was wrong. But I think in the 5 years since that book has come out, my position is actually much stronger than people like, say, Chris Anderson, whose book, The Long Tail, argued would see the emergence of a viable cottage industry of creative people who would be able to earn a living selling their product online. I think what's happened over the last 5 years is that it's harder and harder to sell one's product online. There's no doubt that piracy is still a massive problem, maybe not quite as big a problem now as it was a couple of years ago. But I think the biggest challenge we have on the internet as it becomes the dominant platform for the distribution of data, content, entertainment in the 21st century, the biggest challenge we have is explain to consumers that they need to pay for the content, whether it's through subscriptions on Spotify or Pandora or the New York Times, whether it's for paying for their music rather than stealing it, whether it's buying books. This is the fundamental challenge we have, otherwise we're not going to have a professional creative class. Amateurs, for the most part, aren't very smart in terms of producing viable content. It's very easy to see that. Just go to Wikipedia. Wikipedia remains a good example of the way in which the amateur economy is not able to produce really reliable information. It's open to corruption, and it's very problematic, and it's not supporting professionals. So I think the issues that I raised in Cult of the Amateur are perhaps even more relevant today. I know lots of young musicians, filmmakers, writers, and they're all struggling. They're all struggling to make a living. That doesn't mean that we owe them anything. They don't have a right to an income. But we haven't figured out the internet economy when it comes to paying the creative class. And we collectively, as policymakers and entrepreneurs and investors, we have a responsibility to do that. Otherwise, our newspapers are going to go away. We're not going to have professional writers. Everyone will be an amateur. Everyone will have to wait tables in the day and write their books or make their movies in the evening. And I don't think that's in any of our interests.
So we've punctured, maybe, Silicon Valley's conventional wisdom. It's an election year. Can we puncture some conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C.? This is a place where you have politicians bragging about not understanding technology and then voting on laws that regulate technology. You had former Federal Trade Commissioner Bill Kovacic say a few minutes ago at this conference, it was an antitrust law class I once audited, say that government agencies sue companies sometimes for all the wrong reasons. If Silicon Valley does something stupid, it may be self-correcting. But what happens when Washington, D.C. does something stupid? Should we be more worried about them?
Should we be more worried about Washington, D.C. than Silicon Valley? I think we should be worried about them for opposite reasons. The smartest people in America go to Silicon Valley. The most brilliant people in America, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg or Reid Hoffman, they're the people driving this revolution. They're brilliant, they're the best educated people. Hoffman was at Stanford, Zuckerberg was at Harvard. The elite now goes into the internet. That's where the smart kids go, the Sheryl Sandbergs, the Zuckerbergs. So they're driving policy. The problem with America is, given its anti-political culture, given the hostility towards Washington, D.C., the smartest people don't go into politics. And that process is compounded more and more. So the technologists run rings around politicians. So I think our challenge in America is figuring out, it's like with teaching, how do we get the Reid Hoffmans and the Mark Zuckerbergs to stop worrying about becoming billionaires and become politicians and teachers? Because that's what America needs, perhaps more than successful entrepreneurs, or equally with successful entrepreneurs, are politicians who are as dynamic as the kind of entrepreneurs now flocking to Silicon Valley.
Can we go on and puncture some more?
Do you agree with it? Is that outrageous?
I think it is. I think it's not outrageous, but you're wrong. There is a distinction, because Well, we'll move on to this in the Q&A. I wanted to pose a few more questions to you before we open it up to the audience and we can have an argument among ourselves. Silicon Valley balloons. We heard Google's general counsel, Kent Walker, talk this morning about embracing failure. What's wrong with embracing failure? You were making snide comments during Kent's speech.
Me? Snide comments?
Maybe I shouldn't have exposed you.
Is Kent here?
Kent is here.
Well, I can't be too rude then, especially since we have lots of friends in common. But I think there's a problem with, again, there are lots of cults in Silicon Valley, but one of the most interesting culturally is the cult of failure, is the idea that people have to continually fail to succeed. And I think one of the premises that Kent introduced in his speech was the importance of failure. And I think he's right. But again, there is a new elite in America for whom failure is a badge of honor. I wear that badge of honor. I failed with my first startup, Audio Cafe, but that was the best thing I ever did. It enabled me to get more jobs and write books and come to conferences like this. I think the challenge we have in America is figuring out culturally how to encourage the disadvantaged, the people who live somewhere between San Francisco and New York. We have to explain to them how to fail and why failure is so important. And what we have in America at the moment is this increasing dichotomization between a narrow elite, maybe an East Coast, West Coast, an elite of people who are deeply entrepreneurial and who use this idea of failure to become incredibly successful, and the rest of the country that has no grasp of what it means to fail and why failure is so important. So I'm not saying failure isn't important. What I am saying is that there's a certain kind of parochialism to our discussion about failure. Most of the world isn't listening. Most of the world doesn't understand why failure is important. And that's why I guess we need to teach what it means to be an entrepreneur to people outside Silicon Valley. And what it means to be an entrepreneur is taking risks, is opening oneself up. And that requires a degree of confidence. It requires good education. So it comes to some of the core problems, I think, facing America. But what most worries me, and this isn't just an American issue, is the disappearance of the middle. The internet is both a cause and a consequence of this. Silicon Valley is both a cause and a consequence of the disappearance of a middle class, people who always existed between the elite and the working class. Now, I think that middle is evaporating, and all we have is this narrow elite of driving our sort of technology-centric economy, which is globalized, and everybody else, and very little in between.
Would you have the same feelings if you were a member of the Billionaires Club, a member of that elite, and that company you started had been bought for all the right sums back in 1999?
Would I have the same feeling of what?
How bad Silicon Valley elites are, or how fragmented and segmented it is?
I don't think Silicon Valley elites are bad. I mean, I just made the point that the smartest people in America are guys like Zuckerberg and Hoffman, women like Sandberg. I don't think they're bad. But what I think they are deluded. I think they want to have, like most Americans, they want to be good and rich. And you can either be one or the other. And when you listen to Zuckerberg, when you listen to the young men, or they're not so young anymore at Google, when you listen to Larry Lessig, when you listen to this Silicon Valley crowd, it's always assumed that we can share, we can improve poverty in Africa. Ken Walker used the example of helping some poor Indians at the airport translate some of their stuff. It's always the idea that all this technology benefits everyone, that it democratizes, that it creates progress and empowers and enriches. And I don't think that's true. I think this new elite is no different from any other elite. Big data, the big data economy is no different from large armaments, big pharma. This is the new elite. They're defining the discourse. They are the new landowners. They are controlling power. They will shape Washington, D.C. I don't think they're bad, but they're not good. They're not improving the world. Google hasn't benefited the world. Facebook hasn't benefited the world. They benefited themselves and their shareholders, or some of their shareholders anyway, who managed to sell their stock. But generally, I'm very, very suspicious of the idea that you can do good and be very rich at the same time, or successful.
Let me read you some more things from your books and essays. You wrote about the creeping narcissism and exhibitionism and Facebook's master database of the human race. Putting aside whether that's true or not, I'm not sure we have any Facebook lobbyists in the audience to defend
Are there any
Facebook.
Facebook people here? I thought
didn't
they shut down?
Okay, we do have one. We do have some Facebook representatives in the audience, so maybe we can get to them in the Q&A.
To reveal them. Can you reveal yourself, please? All your data, everything about you. Can we have your timeline?
Public timeline. But is there a bit of hypocrisy on your part? You're listing on your blog, and I'm an avid reader of it, of course, as everyone should be, where you're going to be every day, almost every hour. You put your Twitter screen name on the cover of your book, and isn't writing a book about what you think is true, and you're writing about your trips to London, universities in London, and tech blogger Robert Scoble's house in Half Moon Bay and your experiences there. I mean, isn't this exhibitionistic by its very nature? Are you what you criticize?
Declan, I grew up in England, and always the stereotype of Americans is they don't have a sense of irony. I wrote a book against social networking, particularly against Facebook. I'd written one against Google before, so I couldn't make this one against Google. I actually gave Google the benefit of the doubt in this book. And so what we did at the publishers, we thought, well, let's have some fun. An anti-Facebook book, but let's put my Twitter handle on the front, because it would annoy guys like you. So that's the explanation of that. But more seriously, my book, Digital Vertigo, it's not a Luddite book. It's not against technology. It's not saying we shouldn't be on these networks. In my first chapter, I struggle with the issue that many of us are struggling with. I have to be on Twitter. As you say, it builds my brand, gets me invited to events like this, gets me book deals, gets me my column on CNN, my show on TechCrunch.
Let
me finish.
This is not hypocrisy.
Well, hypocrisy, let me explain, and then you can decide whether or not it's hypocrisy. I make the point that this is the reality of our new economy. We're all brands. We're all building our brands on Twitter and on Facebook. That, for better or worse, is the reality. And in the first chapter in my book, I struggle with this. I say, I'm kind of uncomfortable with it. I don't want to tell the world where I am. But at the same time, I need to tell the world where I am. And I think more and more people who use Facebook and Twitter have this problem. On the one hand, they know they need to be on these networks. On the other hand, they're very uncomfortable with it. And they need to teach their kids the value. So we shouldn't, my book doesn't say let's trash our iPhones, give up our Twitter or Facebook accounts. It's acknowledging this, this paradox that if we want to be strong individuals in the 21st century, we need to maintain our privacy. We need to maintain our autonomy. We need to maintain our secrecy. The problem is that in this all too public 21st century, it's harder and harder to do. Now, if that's what you call hypocrisy, I'm a hypocrite. But I'm no more of a hypocrite, I think, than anybody else here. Because nobody here, I would guess, wants to live completely publicly. No one here wants to turn themselves inside out so that everyone knows where they are all the time.
I can't argue with that one. We can get back to
So I'm not a hypocrite.
At least you're not clearly a hypocrite. You may be a hypocrite. This is still to be proven. But let's move on to buzzwords.
And actually, this issue of hypocrisy is very interesting, because I think you can accuse people, particularly in this culture, of being all sorts of things. But the one thing that's supposedly a kiss of death is hypocrisy. But we're all hypocrites. So I would challenge anyone here to stand up and say that they're not hypocritical in some way. Not that I am, of course.
Let's move on to buzzwords. I was sitting next to you earlier today at the event, and we were talking about buzzwords during the conversation. In Silicon Valley, where both of us live, we have robust scalable, big data, disruptive social solutions. And maybe you could throw in pivot, which is one of the latest buzzwords. But in DC, you have spending political capital on leveraging a bring-to-the-table multi-stakeholder process.
I've heard multi-stakeholder a lot today. What does that mean?
I'm a little lost. Anyone can explain what multi-stakeholder process means? Well, which is worse, DC or Silicon Valley?
What's worse, Silicon Valley? Well, I think they're the different sides of the same coin. As I said, I think the problem is a kind of balance. I think the problem with Silicon Valley is that it lacks any kind of regulation. That there's a sort of a cowboy.
As a factual matter, that's not true. Every major company in this audience has been subject of a lawsuit, an investigation, an FTC probe, attorney general action, state AGs, class action lawsuits. There's a lot of stuff out there.
Okay, but I think that there isn't, in some ways, I think the example of Facebook I mean the idea that the cowboy mentality of working outside the law is turned into another kind of orthodoxy in Silicon Valley. It's assumed that that's a good thing, which I think explains a lot of the behavior of Facebook, particularly around its IPO. The problem, of course, with DC is it's wallowing, it's suffocating in legislation, and in this obsession with legislating everything. So I guess the idea, what's worse is Washington D.C. What's worse is a country tied down with red tape. I mean, I just did a piece on innovation in Greece for CNN. And I interviewed a number of entrepreneurs there, and they're all complaining about the same thing. They're all saying that the state there is deeply hostile to innovation. If you become bankrupt in Greece, you end up in jail. So it's a catastrophe for innovation. But just because, again, your question seems to suggest what's worse, DC or Silicon Valley, doesn't take Silicon Valley off the hook. Just because Washington, D.C. is mired in problems doesn't mean that the problems with Silicon Valley aren't as real as anything else.
Let's open this up to the audience for questions. We have, we already know that there are folks from Google and Facebook here, so maybe they can discuss whether or not you're a hypocrite. I see a hand up over in the corner.
I'm not on Facebook. I made a conscious effort. My first book was against blogging, and I had a blog. So the first time any journalist ever interviewed me, they always used to ask the same question. So I was determined not to fall into that trap with this book. So I'm a Facebook dissenter. I gave up Facebook, and it dramatically improved my life because I never read about people who irritated me, who I didn't like. The reality of Facebook is we only ever read on our accounts about people we don't like. Real friends don't post on Facebook.
If you could, let's go to a question over there, and if you could identify yourself, that would be lovely.
Thanks, Declan. It's Patrick Wilson from the Semiconductor Industry Association. I'd like to be a little bit creative and say your definition of who the creative class is might be a bit wrong for Silicon Valley, because my view would be there's no silicon left in Silicon Valley, and that's the real crisis. We're not manufacturing things there because it's an incredibly hostile place to actually make things. And if you look at where the creative class is, they get their capital in Silicon Valley, but they have to go elsewhere to actually develop it. And I wonder what you think about that and how it fits into your kind of overall worldview.
No silicon in Silicon Valley? This is in part Sacramento.
Well,
that has driven
and maybe
out.
my idea of a creative class is a little narrower than that. When I talk about a creative class, I'm talking about writers, filmmakers, musicians. That's my main interest. But I think you're right. Again, I don't think you can blame Silicon Valley for the fact that much of the manufacturing takes place outside Silicon Valley. Although more and more, I mean, there's the Tesla story. I mean, Tesla's producing stuff in Silicon Valley. I mean, that's a broader question of globalization. So I'm not really sure of what to make of your, I mean, are you saying people should make more stuff in America? I mean, I'm in favor of globalization. So I don't have a problem with Apple manufacturing their stuff in China. As long as they conform to standards in terms of the way they treat their workers. That has been a big issue recently. But I don't think it's a problem that products should be manufactured out of America. Whether or not they're designed in Silicon Valley is neither here nor there. I'm sympathetic to most elements of globalization.
If you actually look at U.S. manufacturing output, it keeps going up and up. The number of people working in manufacturing keeps going down because of higher productivity and things that the economists can talk about.
I mean, the issue of Chris Anderson, who wrote The Long Tail, or he's going to call it The Wrong Tail. The Long Tail is coming out with a book in the fall called Makers, which argues that we're on the verge of a new manufacturing revolution with new technologies like 3D printers. Suddenly, manufacturing, he argues, is going to be democratized. And I think that's the next wave. It's really interesting. I mean, I don't always agree with what Anderson says. I'm not sure if I agree with what he argues in Makers. But this issue of the next democratized wave of industrial revolution, I think will change the way in which many products get manufactured. As more and more entrepreneurs can use these products to manufacture their own products. There's been more and more stories about how manufacturing now, small manufacturing concerns which are supported by Kickstarter, are actually now much more attractive to investors than software startups. So I think we might be on the cusp of perhaps a new kind of renaissance when it comes to manufacturing and the way in which the factory has been democratized by technology. On the other hand, it will also lead to all the same problems that the internet has created. The same problems of the crisis of toy manufacturers, car manufacturers. So the manufacturing elite, which dominated the American and the global industrial economy in the 19th and 20th century, is about to be hit by the same tsunami that hit the media industry in the 1990s. And it's going to be even bloodier, more traumatic, and also more interesting.
Let's take another question from the audience. There's in the back, and then we have someone in the front afterwards. So please, identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Yes, Nigel Cameron, Center for Policy and Emerging Technologies in Washington, D.C. I've recently read your book, Andrew. Thank you. And enjoyed it enormously for the clarity of its analysis. I'd be very interested to hear how you see the future trending, specifically on this question of, I mean, what we've done a certain amount about at CPET is the contrasting cultures of the Valley and the District. It seemed to me that the two most potent pieces of real estate in the world are these two very circumscribed communities, which basically ignore each other, somewhat despise each other, and getting some sort of alignment between them, degree by degree of arc, seems to me to be part of the driver of sanity in the future. But I'd be interested to know how you see these things trending so that one could predict in 5 and 10 years the likely direction of this obsession with regulation, legislation, and largely irrelevant political issues in Washington, and what you have so firmly described, clearly described in charcoal drawings of the Valley.
Well, I think that the political system in America is archaic. It's archaic for many different reasons. It's archaic for the industrial two-party system, for the very static hierarchical relationship between voters and politicians, in the way it attempts to manipulate media, in the way in which ideology is presented. So I think it will change. Silicon Valley won't change. Silicon Valley will remain, maybe as an idea and as a geographical expression, will remain the driving force in the American economy for certainly as long as I live. But I think that Washington, D.C. has to change. I think that the change will come through perhaps third parties, through the democratization and radicalization of the political process, through emergence of parties in Europe like the Piracy Party, through the rise perhaps of individuals who can mobilize and create political movements outside the traditional process. Now, some people here would think that's a great thing, and in some ways perhaps it is. But on the other hand, what I most fear is the way in which mob leaders can leverage the internet and these new democratizing structures to create movements of rage. Already seeing it in Greece, for example. The movements of the left, and particularly of the right, as a consequence of the economic collapse, are pretty much financed and driven off the internet. And if America was to experience the same kind of deep economic crisis that's just happening in Greece or in Italy or Spain, I would fear the way in which mob leaders would leverage the internet to create movements of rage. You already see this on the internet in the way in which people get picked on. You have this mob mentality, particularly, I think, on networks like Twitter. So I'm not sure whether I'm hopeful or fearful about the political future, perhaps depending on the economic future of this country. But what I would say is that Washington, D.C. has to change because it's so archaic. It's so out of step, not so much with the rest of America, but with the rest of the world, that eventually that must change.
Another question, please.
Yes,
And you are?
I'm Harold Felt with Public Knowledge, and
He's a troublemaker.
I do my very best, being one of those less brilliant people who went to Washington rather than Silicon Valley.
Yeah, but Harold, you half regret that, don't you?
You realize
Because
you
you're
insulted much of the audience here.
No, but Harold, you're the example you're the counterexample. If there were more Harold Felds in Washington, D.C., we wouldn't be worrying so much about it. How do we get more guys like you to D.C.?
Well, that's actually what I wanted to ask you about. Because I would say that one of the problems that leads to the mob mentality that you were just talking about, and this problem is we have spent a good 30 or so years systemically undermining the legitimacy of every non-mob violence way of resolving our differences.
Well, give some examples. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is, we used to pride ourselves on being a country that was a rule of law, that had institutions that we by and large trusted to at least have the best interests of the public at heart. Whether they were always successful or not, we at least had an idea that the purpose of government and of politics was to find a way to resolve differences, say, between auto manufacturers and those who purchase cars, so that the cars did not blow up unexpectedly, that we had mechanisms to address environmental problems, such as, were we still going to have clean water? And we had courts that we trusted to resolve important questions. People weren't always happy with the result, but at least there was a sense that we had a good alternative to getting everybody together on Facebook and trying to intimidate people into doing something different. The question that I have is, so nobody likes the number of times we heard today, the FCC just ought to be eliminated because we don't like it and we don't think it'll be a good job. Well, Congress...
Well, that's just Barron, our in-house libertarian. Right?
Congress is awful, and all politics is intrinsically a waste of time.
Yeah.
Now, the courts are equally, well, since it's the politicians who appointed the judges, we don't trust, what they have to say. But the one thing we apparently trust is when we can get 100,000 people pissed on Facebook, we can get Verizon to change the way they handle my bill. So my concern is, how do we rebuild trust in our essential institutions so that people who are, smart and talented would actually have an interest in wanting to serve there in the first place?
You're sounding, Howard, a lot like me.
A lot of people have said that today. I think it's the altitude.
No, I think your point is a really important one. And I think one of the things that I try and bring out in my work is the centrality of the internet as a sort of a political or cultural force in our age. A lot of people think the internet was just delivered by a stork in the middle of the night. We all woke up one morning and it was there, and it was this wonderful free thing where we could express ourselves. But the internet is a consequence of the very thing you're talking about, the crisis of the state, the decline in trust, the failure of political elites to maintain legitimacy, the crisis of the two-party political system, the crisis of every elite. And much of this is justified, from banking to pharmaceuticals, the crises of the wars and all the rest of it. So I think often people say, oh, the internet's great because it allows us to have a voice. It allows us to challenge government. It allows us to disintermediate. But what they misunderstand is that the internet was created by the very people who resisted the old establishments. The people who didn't go to DC, they went, as Declan suggested, they went to communes in Northern California, and then they invented the internet. So I think the issue then is more structural, and it deals with the core problem in American history, which is the lack of legitimacy for politics and the political process. And until people can be proud to enter politics, guys like Zuckerberg and Hoffman and Sandberg are going to go to Silicon Valley and not go to DC. But it's a deeper problem. I think it's very much connected also with the educational problem as well.
We have just minutes left, but I'd like to take one more quick question and a quick response.
How quick?
Well, how about 60 seconds? I'll time you.
It better be a good question.
There's no pressure.
Hi, my name is Anjane. I'm an undergraduate at Stanford University. And my question is basically...
What's funny about that?
My question is whether you see the problem with the media since you're part of TechCrunch. We have a word in our dorms. Every time TechCrunch releases a story on Stanford called Crunched It. So we say, oh, we got crunched today. And the idea is that the problem with, you're saying, educating people between Silicon Valley and New York is not that they don't know that there's this opportunity. The problem is that media outlets like TechCrunch basically say Silicon Valley is the end of the world. I mean, that's where you want to end up. The number of students I've met this summer at George Washington and at Georgetown who are studying political science and who would make great people in DC now want to move to Silicon Valley because when they open the front page of the New York Times, that's what they see.
But you can't blame, again, you're blaming the messenger. You're saying, oh, people read TechCrunch or they read the New York Times and therefore they're seduced into becoming entrepreneurs. The reality, but that's, again, TechCrunch is a reflection of our deeper culture. The new rock stars of our age, in the 60s when everyone was growing up, they wanted to be Lennon or McCartney or Jagger. Today, these kids don't want to be musicians, they want to be entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are the new rock stars, which is good in some ways, and guys like Zuckerberg deserve to be rock stars. They're very brilliant, they're very charismatic. Our challenge is making them more accountable and making them understand that the world is actually more complex than it first seems. That's why the Steve Jobs story is so symbolic. Jobs is the metaphor of our age, both in the best and the worst ways. Jobs managed to invent and reinvent himself and create the most valuable company in the world. He's clearly a charismatic man, no respect for democracy, any kind of democracy, never gave his money to any public interest. So we have to understand that the entrepreneur is the central cultural figure. It's not the central economic figure, it's the central cultural figure. And that publications like TechCrunch are merely reflecting that reality. TechCrunch didn't create Zuckerberg, we created him. For better or worse, he's ours. He's our responsibility, and we are his responsibility. And until we begin to understand the accountability and the responsibility of these new relationships, of these child entrepreneurs and billionaires, we're going to be a much poorer society.
And that will be the last word. Thank you for the Technology Policy Institute for organizing this, and thank you, Andrew, for being a good sport, even if you're wrong occasionally.
Always wrong. Thank you, Declan, for being so right.